I am Tamis Incarnation and I welcome you all to ACP 31 for Auditing Theory. Our topic for today will be about the general audit process, including the first step, accepting the engagement. So class, these are the steps in an audit engagement. First, accepting an engagement. This is the evaluation on both the auditor side and the prospective client's factor on the auditability of the prospective client's financial statement. So, unsa ba ning accepting an engagement? So, ang first step jud sa ato ang audit engagement kay kanina step. This is an evaluation whether to render an audit engagement to a prospective client or not. So, kani siya na step, it is presumed that the auditor has already a client and the auditor is evaluating whether the audit can be offered to such client or otherwise. So, i-consider ni siya na step regardless the auditor performs a first-time audit or a recurring audit na siya sa ato ang client. So, in accepting the engagement, there are factors to consider based on the combinations of the audit standards presented previously. First, ang pinaka-importante is the integrity of the principal owners, key management, and those charged with governance of the entity. So, in gathering the information as to the integrity of our prospective client, there are certain ways na pwede nato buhaton. Una, makig-communicate sa ato ang predecessor auditor or sa predecessor auditor sa atong client. Unsa ba ni predecessor auditor? Predecessor auditor is ang auditor sa ato ang prospective client before siya nag-change og auditor og niadto sa ato. And then we can also communicate and inquire sa other third parties such as bankers, legal counsel, and industry peers na na-involvement sa ato ang prospective client. Or di kaya mag-background search ta sa relevant databases. Nganong importante ba na makicommunicate ta sa predecessor auditor sa atong prospective client? This is because this is a necessary procedure and inquiry sa ato ang predecessor auditor may be able to provide information that will assist the successor auditor in deciding whether to accept the engagement. So, the communication should be done, however, only after an engagement has been offered. Kung walay offer of engagement ni prospective client, of course, wala po tayo karapatan na mag-inquire sa iyahang predecessor auditor. It is the successor auditor's responsibility to initiate the contact between him and the predecessor auditor. The successor auditor, however, must seek first the permission of the prospective client to make inquiries of the predecessor auditor. Kay kung dili siya musugot, so if a prospective client refuses to permit the predecessor auditor to respond or limits the response, the successor auditor should determine the reasons thereof and consider the implications of that refusal in deciding whether to accept the engagement or not. So, if ever mag-refuse si client na mo answer or mo respond ang predecessor auditor sa ato ang mga inquiries, then dapat may balaan jud niya kay prospective client nganong dili ing ana kay aron ma-consider pud niya kung dapat jud ba niya i-accept ang engagement niya kay client or dili. So sa pag-communicate, unsa ba dapat ato ang i-inquire kay predecessor auditor? The successor auditor should make specific and reasonable inquiries of the predecessor auditor regarding the matters that will assist him in determining whether to accept the engagement. So, matters subject to inquiry may include information that might bear on the integrity of the management, kana importante kay siya, any disagreements with the management as to the accounting policies, auditing procedures, or other similarly significant matters, and lastly, the predecessor auditor's understanding as to the reasons for the change of auditors. Kani, importante kayo ni siya kay pwede man there are certain instances that would um, pwede na negatively affect sa decision ni successor auditor in accepting the engagement. Pero pwede man po na nag-change lang og auditor kay um, lapas 3 years na sila sa ilang auditor, so kailangan na sila mag-change ing ana. So now that we have considered the integrity of our principal owners, ang second consideration nato kay whether the engagement team is competent to perform the audit engagement and has the necessary capabilities including time and resources. So kani siya dapat i-consider nato ang profiles sa atuang engagement team. Kay what if di ay within our engagement team kay naay related sa ato ang prospective client. Kana siya, it would create a conflict of interest. So, dapat mag-profiling pud ta sa member sa ato ang engagement team. And then, ikatulo, whether the firm and the engagement team can comply with relevant ethical requirements and significant matters that have arisen during the current or previous audit engagement and their implications for continuing the relationship. Unsa bay pasabot ani? So, significant matters may have arisen during the current or previous engagement and their implications should be considered in continuing the relationship. For example, a client may have started to expand its business operations into an area where the firm does not possess the necessary knowledge or expertise. So, kana na matter, huna-hunaon sa jud nagbaayon ni successor auditor kung mupadayon pa ba siya og engage kay client kay una wala siya experience ato na operations. So, pwede na makompromise na noon ang iyahang audit. Tungod kay dili man siya competent enough para mag-audit ato na business. So now, we'll go to the preconditions for an audit. Aside from the above-mentioned factors whether to accept an audit or not, the auditor should also see to it that the preconditions for an audit are present. In order to establish whether the preconditions for an audit are present, the auditor shall first, determine whether the financial reporting framework to be applied in the preparation of the financial statements is acceptable. Kana, importante na. Ikaduha, obtain the agreement of management that it acknowledges and understands its responsibility. So, kani siyang tulo, kaning tulo, responsibility na siya sa management. So, first, the preparation of the financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework, including where relevant their fair presentation. Ikaduha, ang internal control as management determines is necessary to enable the preparation of the financial statements that are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. And ikatulo, to provide the auditor with first, access to all information of which the management is aware that is relevant to the preparation of the financial statements such as records, documentation, and other matters kailangan i-provide na nila sa auditor. Ikatulo, additional information that the auditor may request from the management for the purpose of the audit. And number 3, unrestricted access. Unrestricted access to persons within the entity from whom the auditor determines it necessary to obtain audit evidence. So, kani sila tanan, these are the preconditions of an audit. So, karon, once the auditor consider the factors, katong tanan factors in accepting the engagement, and decided to render an audit engagement, then, to formally document the presence of the preconditions to the audit, the auditor and the client must agree to the terms of the engagement. So, the agreed terms for the audit engagement shall be recorded in an audit engagement letter or other suitable form of written agreement and shall include, first, the objective and the scope of the audit of the financial statements. Second, the responsibilities of the auditor. Third, the responsibilities of the management. Fourth, identification of the applicable financial reporting framework for the preparation of the financial statements. And lastly, reference to the expected form and content of any reports to be issued by the auditor, and a statement that there may be circumstances in which a report may differ from its expected form and content. Mao na siya dapat ang sulod sa ato ang audit engagement letter. Sa recurring audits pod, the auditor shall assess whether the circumstances require the terms of the audit engagement to be revised, and whether there is a need to remind the entity of the existing terms of the audit engagement. However, the following factors may make it appropriate to revise the terms of the audit engagement or to remind the entity of the existing terms. So first, any indication that the entity misunderstands the objective and scope of the audit, any revised or special terms of the audit engagement, if there is a recent change of senior management. Fourth, there is a significant change in ownership, a significant change in nature or size of the entity's business. Sixth, a change in legal or regulatory requirements. Then, ang pang-7, there is a change in the financial reporting framework adopted in the preparation of the financial statements. And there is a change in other reporting requirements. The auditor shall not agree to a change in the terms of the audit engagement where there is no reasonable justification for doing so. If, prior to the completing of the audit engagement, the auditor is requested to change the audit engagement to an engagement that conveys a lower level of assurance, the auditor shall determine whether there is a reasonable justification for doing so. If the terms of the audit engagement are changed, the audit and the management shall agree on and record the new terms of the engagement in an engagement letter or other suitable form of written agreement. So, if the auditor is unable to agree to a change of the terms of the audit engagement and is not permitted by management to continue the original audit engagement, the auditor shall dara. So again, pag ang auditor kay dili siya agree sa change sa term sa audit engagement ug wala gi-permit sa management na i-continue ang katong original na audit engagement, the auditor shall withdraw from the audit engagement where possible under applicable law or regulation, and determine whether there is any obligation, either contractual or otherwise, to report the circumstances to other parties, such as those charged with governance, owners, or regulators. Kay pwede magud na ang change sa term sa engagement kay dili jud siya reasonable, so mag-withdraw jud si auditor sa audit engagement. And if applicable, dapat po na niya i-report sa certain parties na involved, including those charged with governance, owners, or regulators. In relation to the changes in the terms of an audit engagement, what are some of the conditions that may lead to a justifiable change in the terms of an audit engagement? The following are considered justifiable reasons for a client's request for a change in the engagement. First, a change in the circumstances that affects the need for the service. Ikaduha, there is a misunderstanding as to the nature of the service as originally requested. So, if the auditor concludes that there is reasonable justification to change the engagement due to the above reasons, the report issued would be that appropriate for the revised terms of the engagement and not include reference to the original engagement or mention any procedures that may have been performed in the original engagement. What are some of the circumstances that are considered unreasonable basis in requesting a change in the terms of an audit engagement? So, a request for a change in the engagement would not be considered reasonable if, una, it appeared that the change na gusto sa management relates to the information that is incorrect, incomplete, or otherwise unsatisfactory, in which pag ang change kay ing-ani would lead to misleading na noon na audit engagement. Ikaduha, there is a restriction in the scope of the engagement, whether imposed by management or caused by circumstances. So, ang audit engagement ay where the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding material accounts and the client asks for the engagement to be changed to a lower level engagement to avoid a qualified opinion or a disclaimer opinion. Pag mauni reason sa client, maong gusto sila i-change ang terms of the engagement, then dili na makakolekta og sufficient appropriate evidence si auditor para maka-examine og accounts. And sa ing-ani na changes sa kaning duha, if mauni ang changes na gusto sa auditor sa para ma-change ang terms sa audit engagement, then si auditor kay naay karapatan na mo withdraw sa engagement, because it would be unreasonable na mo padayon sa pag-audit sa isa ka client kung dili di ay kung hatagan di siya og scope limitation na to the point or to the extent na ma-compromise na ang audit. So now, let's go to the audit of components. So, is there a need to send a separate audit engagement letter to a component of a parent entity who is also an audit client? So, when the auditor of the parent entity is also the auditor of a component, the factors that may influence the decision of whether to send a separate audit engagement letter to the component include the following. So, una, who appoints the component auditor? Ikaduha, whether a separate auditor's report is to be issued on the component. Then, ikatulo, legal requirements in relation to audit appointments. Then, we have the degree of ownership by the parent and the degree of independence of the component management from an entity. So, kani siya ng mga factors dapat i-consider ni siya as to whether kailangan pa ba nato mag-send og separate na audit engagement letter sa component. So, after accepting an engagement, di ba, na anay audit engagement letter. Tapos, pag nagkasinabot na sa regarding the engagement through the written form na audit engagement letter, then karon pwede na ta magbuhat og audit plan. So, second step sa atoang audit engagement is the audit planning. Unsa ba ni siya? Obtaining detailed understanding about the entity and its environment and the formulation of an audit strategy which shall serve as the basis of our audit program. So, sa audit planning, naatay duha ka procedures. We have risk assessment procedures and the consideration of internal control. So, sa risk assessment procedures, these are performed and include inquiries of the management and others within the entity, analytical procedures, observation and inspection, and other procedures. Sa consideration of internal control pod, the auditor considers the entity's internal control because this directly affects the reliability of the financial statements. So, the stronger the internal control, the more assurance it provides about the reliability of accounting records and financial information. So, kani silang duha, kaning risk assessment procedures o consideration of internal control will be further discussed at the later part. Kani siya kay pahapyaw lang ni siya. Nang ato ang audit planning involves two procedures, ang risk assessment procedures and consideration of internal control. So, after sa audit planning, unsa man atong buhaton? Mag-perform na taog substantive tests unsa ba ni siya. So, performing substantive tests kay performing audit procedures based on the audit plan in order to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence to support the auditor's opinion. So, 'di ba sa audit planning ang nahitabo, nag-gain lang ta og information para mas ma-understand nato ang operation sa entity o ang iyahang environment. Kung unsa jud ba yang nature, ing ana. Sa performing substantive test, diri na ta mag-gather og sufficient and appropriate evidence. And then, diri na pud musulod ang ato ang pag-consider sa financial statement assertions. So karon, let's talk about financial statement assertions. So, assertions refers to the declaration made by the management, explicit or otherwise, that are reflected in the financial statements as used by the auditor to consider as basis for potential misstatements that may occur. So, kani siyang assertions made by the management kay actually morning mga claims ni management na um, nahitabo jud sa ilahang company. So, for example, naa sila mga PPE sa ilahang financial statements. Ang claim ana ni ang claim ana ni client's management kay naga-exist to siya na mga PPE tanan. So, ang buhaton ni auditor ana, in order to validate the existence na claim ni management, mag-ocular inspection si auditor, and then maghinay-hinay siya og kanang tan-aw dito kung naga-exist pa jud ba tong mga asset na gipang-declare nila sa ilang financial statement. Then these declarations made by the management may be classified by the auditor and may be used as the basis whether the financial statement is fairly presented or not. So, assertions used by the auditor to consider the different types of potential misstatements that may occur fall into the following categories and may take the following forms. Ang first, kay assertions about classes of transactions and events for the period under audit. Occurrence. These are refers to the transactions and events that have been recorded and pertain to the entity. So, kani siya na assertion is that, for example, naay transaction for the year. Let's say purchase transaction for the year. So kato dapat na transaction kay na hitabo jud siya during the year, and then ang client jud nato mismo ang nagpalit sa iyang gi-purchase o dapat sila pud mismo ang nag-record. So, inga na ang occurrence. Ikaduha, completeness. All transactions and events that have been recorded have been recorded. So, purchases lang gyapon atong sample. Kintahay na ay purchases. Unsaon ba nato pagkabalo kung kompleto tong purchases ni client? So, maghinay-hinay ta og kanang pangayo og documents sa iyaha such as the vouchers, tapos unsa ba pay pwede i-examine ang ilahang mga other pertinent documents na in relation sa sale, purchase orders, mga receipts, mga like ingana na mga documents. So, si auditor po dapat para ma-validate po ang completeness, napod na siya certain audit procedures na buhaton. Amounts and other data relating to the recorded transactions and events have been recorded appropriately. Ang example ani kay salaries and wages. So, ang salaries ba na naa sa financial statement sa atoang client kay tama ba ang amount? Properly deducted ba sa og taxes o kanang other government remittances? Ing ana. So, letter D, cut off. Transactions and events have been recorded in the correct accounting period. An example would be salaries and wages. So, sa FS ni client ay salaries and wages. Karon, ang katong salaries and wages should pertain to all the salaries na sa employees within the current year. Dapat walay masagol ato na for the next year. And then, accruals and prepaid expenses also should be accounted for properly. Letter E, classification. Transactions and events have been recorded in the proper accounts. For example, sa salaries and wages ni client, kay naay two classifications. Naatay general and administrative o naapod tay salaries for operating expenses. So, karon dapat ang salaries pertaining to general and admin ma-record siya o ma-classify siya dito pud sa Gen Ad. Tapos, kung pertaining to OPEX po, dapat dito po siya sa OPEX. Ana lang. Second assertion kay about account balances at period end. Account balances at period end. So, ang una ani existence. Assets, liabilities, and equity interests exist. So, same lang gihapon sa akong example ganina. Naatay naay mga PPE ang ato ang client. So, in order to know whether it really exists, kailangan ta mag-ocular inspection aron mahibal-an nato kung tama jud ba to ang iyang ang assertion sa ato sa management na existing jud ang ilahang mga PPE. Ikaduha, rights and obligations. The entity holds or controls the rights to assets, liabilities, and liabilities are obligations of the entity. Ang example ani would be sa inventory. Kintahay si client or si company kay naa siya'y gi-consign nga inventory sa iyahang friend. Karon, kinsa bay naay right sa asset, si friend or si company? Of course, ang tag-iya sa inventory kay si company, kay siya man ang consignor. So, ang naay right na mag-record sa inventory kay si company. Karon pod, what if baliktad? Si friend ang nagpa-consign kay company or si friend ang nagpabaligya sa iyahang product kay company. Karon pod si on the part of the company wala siya i-record na asset kay dili man to iyaha. So dapat ang mag-record kay si friend. And then next, completeness. All assets, liabilities, and equity interests that should have been recorded have been recorded. Same lang gihapon sa transaction ganina. Kaso kani, this pertains to all assets, liabilities, and equity. Ang maora jud siya class na tanan nimo kintahay dito ta sa inventory lang gihapon. Dapat tanan nimo gi-purchase kay well recorded properly og na-account jud sa imuhang inventory. And then next, valuation and allocation. Assets, liabilities, and equity interests are included in the financial statements at appropriate amounts, and any resulting valuation or allocation adjustments are appropriately recorded. So si inventory, example takla sa inventory. Unsaon ba pag-measure sa inventory? Inventory should be measured at lower of cost or net realizable value per PAS2. Karon, ang atuang buhaton ani as auditors kay mag-try ta og recompute or mag-try ta og evaluate sa amount sa inventory sa ato ang client. If tama jud ba ang ilang valuation or kung unsa ba yung ilang gigamit, kung nag-FIFO ba sila, ing ana. Should also be taken into consideration. Then third class sa assertions is about presentation and disclosure. So first, occurrence and rights and obligations. Disclosed events, transactions, and other matters have occurred and pertain to the entity. So, ang kani po ni assertion is about disclosure ni clients ayang FS about certain events, transactions na nag-occur jud sa entity. So, kintahay within the year kay naa sila'y So, kintahay within the year kay naay mga related party transaction. So, dapat si auditor i-validate to niya kung nahitabo jud ba to na transaction sa company ing ana. Kung naa jud by right ang company as to the kung unsa man tong related party na transaction nila, kung receivable ba or payable, ana. Tapos, completeness. All disclosures that should have been included in the financial statements have been included. So, dapat tanan disclosure sa iyaha sa FS sa ato ang client, dapat walay kulang. Kintahay, daghan man jud mga important na disclosure. For example, ang kato related party transaction kana especially pag material dapat siya i-disclose. Unsa pa ba? Ang pag-disclose sa property, plant and equipment, sa mga receivables, ingana. Ikatulo, classification and understandability. Financial information is appropriately presented and described, and disclosures are clearly expressed. Properly classified ba ang mga accounts? Kintahay, ang kanailahang receivables, naa man jud nay current og non-current. So, tama ba ilang classification as to the amounts kung pila ang current og non-current? For example, pod katong sa salaries lang gihapon, tama ba to ilahang amount sa ilahang OPEX o sa ilahang general administrative? Ing ana. Tapos, in order to be useful jud sa users, dapat understandable pud siya na kani siya na disclosure kay about ing ani, ing ana. Or kintahay, ang nakabutang na heading kay cash and cash equivalents, and then ang nabutang jud, ang sulod jud ato na disclosure kay about PPE. Of course, misleading na siya sa user sa financial statement. Then letter D, accuracy and valuation. Financial and other information are disclosed fairly and at appropriate amounts. Kani siya kay this refers pod sa accuracy na jud sa amounts. And when it comes to also valuation, ang perfect example ana kay ang inventory, kung tama, kung at lower of cost or not realizable value ba ang amount sa inventory. Tapos if sa PPE kay na-establishan ba og tarong og depreciation ana. Tapos sa ato ang receivables kay tama ba tong gi-establish na impairment ing ana class. So now that we have already discussed the financial statement assertions, let's now go to the audit procedures. In gathering sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, the auditor should perform one or combination of audit procedures to test every assertion made by the client or management. Audit procedures include but not limited to, so kani nga mga audit procedures again, mao ni ang buhaton sa auditor aron i-test tong mga assertions na gi-claim or gi-declare ni client. So first, inspection. This involves examining records or documents, whether internal or external, in paper form, electronic form, or other media, or a physical examination of an asset. So, inspection, unsa ba'y pwede i-inspect ni auditor para ma-validate ang isa sa assertions ni client. So, ang assertion na pwede nato gamitan og inspection na procedure kay ang pag-inspect sa mga PPE. Ocular inspection class, mao to siya class. Aron ma-validate tong existence na assertion ni client about sa iyahang assets. Then, moadto si auditor dito sa iyahang business or sa iyahang place para matan-aw kung naa jud tong asset. Another example would be inspection sa documents. Kung tama ba ang recording, And usually, kailangan jud mag-audit walkthrough para makasabot jud sa um, operation sa isa ka client. Ikaduha, observation consists of looking at a process or procedure being performed by others. So, um, ang buhaton lang ani class kay mag-observe lang mo sa inyuhang client kung unsay pamaagi nila sa pag-record sa ilahang mga purchases or kung unsa ba yung mga pamaagi nila sa um, transaction nila if na-ay sale ay nga na class. Ikatulo, external confirmation represents audit evidence obtained by the auditor as a direct written response to the auditor from a third party or the confirming party in paper form or by electronic or other medium. External confirmation, ang example kay mga bank confirmation, mga receivable and payable na confirmations, anak. Kaya usually manggod, basta ang external ang source sa information, reliable jud na siya class kay dili man na basta-basta matamper. And then, kaupat, recalculation consists of checking the mathematical accuracy of documents or records. Recalculation may be performed manually or electronically. Recalculation, nun sa may pwede na sample, recalculation of depreciation expense, recalculation of impairment losses, recalculation of salaries and wages, nagi-declare ni client sa iyahang financial statements. Tan-awon kung reasonable ba to iyahang mga gibutang dito o kung accurate ba. Ikalima, re-performance involves the auditor's independent execution of procedures or controls that were originally performed as part of the entity's internal control. So, re-performance, usually ani kay pag mag-test lang sa ka-effective sa internal control ni client. Sige lang class kay mag-discuss man po test of controls. And then, analytical procedures consists of evaluations of financial information made by a study of plausible relationships among both financial and non-financial data. Tapos, we have inquiry. Consists of seeking information of knowledgeable persons, both financial and non-financial, within the entity or outside the entity. Usually, mao ni ang pinakagamit na audit procedure, especially pag nagatry pa lang ka og understand sa operation sa entity. So, inquire jud ka, mangutana jud ka na ma'am ngano yung ani nahitabo, ngano ing ani. Kay isa na siya sa makatabang sa imuha as auditor na mag-assess sa assertions sa financial statement ni management. And then, please take note that the auditor should perform the audit procedure based on its audit plan with the intention of gathering sufficient and appropriate evidence to support the audit opinion. And class, audit plan is not just at the beginning of the process. It's actually all throughout the audit process. Kay usually manggod kintahay, hapit na mo mahuman sa audit and then naamoy na-discover na certain account na wala ninyo gi-consider na dapat i-examine. Kay usually risk-based audit raman na. So, pag tanaw ninyo, hala, risky man din siya na account, kanang wala gi-appeal. So, mag-revise og plan, tapos, apilon ay kuan na pod og certain na audit procedures para i-examine to na account. So, now that we have already discussed the performing substantive test step in an audit engagement, we'll now go to the fourth step, which is the completing the audit. Necessary procedures performed to gather additional evidence to support the opinion and to communicate with the management prior to the issuance of an audit report. The completion stage of the audit is of crucial importance. It is during the completion stage that the auditor reviews the evidence obtained during the audit together with the final version of the financial statements with the objective of forming the auditor's opinion. During the completion stage of the audit, nganong importante man kaayo na mag-perform ta og analytical procedures. So, the purpose of performing analytical procedures at the completion stage near the end of the audit is to assist the auditor in performing an overall conclusion as to whether the financial statements are consistent with the auditor's understanding of the entity. Analytical procedures performed as an overall review in the completion of an audit usually involves reading the financial statements and so maoni siya. Una, consider unusual or unexpected account balances or relationships that were not previously identified during the audit. Ikaduha, consider the adequacy of audit evidence regarding previously identified unusual or unexpected balances. And lastly, assess the conclusions reached and evaluate the overall financial statement presentation. Maong importante kaayo ang analytical procedures sa completion stage sa audit. Aside sa completion stage, asa pa ba nato gina-perform ang analytical procedures? Any idea? Sige, sa planning stage of the audit, which will be further discussed at a later part. So now, we'll go to the subsequent events and going concern. Kanimang gud silang duha is important sa completion stage of the audit. Unsa ba nang subsequent events? So, kaning subsequent events requires the auditor to perform audit procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence that all events occurring between the date of the financial statements and the auditor's report that require adjustment of or disclosure in the financial statements have been identified. So, past 10 events after the reporting period identifies two types of subsequent events. Una, natay type on subsequent events. These subsequent events provide evidence of conditions that existed at the date of the financial statements. So, these events usually require adjustment to the financial statements kay existing man siya as of the date sa atuang FS. Ikaduha, type 2 subsequent events. Kani sila na events provide evidence of the conditions that arose after the date of the financial statements. So, these events require disclosure in but not adjustments to the financial statements. Tapos, diri punta sa going concern assumption. Pero before ta going concern, mag-try lang tao kanang hatag og example sa subsequent events. For type 1 or the adjusting events, kanang kailangan og adjustment, example kay bankruptcy of a customer which occurs after the reporting period. Ikaduha, try punta aning type 2 subsequent events. Usually, type 2 subsequent events are conditions that did not exist at or before the date of the financial statements. Ang katong isa, katong bankruptcy, those are, kato siya, example to sa events na existing na siya at the end of the reporting period. So, kay na-bankrupt man siya, then, ang atuang report, financial statement as of year-end kay possibly kulang siya og allowance for probable losses. So, probably, kato siya na event is material enough para makamistate sa ato ang financial statement. So, kailangan nato siya i-adjust. Ang ikaduha pod, ang katong type 2 subsequent events are conditions that did not exist at or before the date of the financial statements but are disclosed because they may be of such significance that the financial statements would be misleading if the events are not disclosed. Example, kanang damage from fire, flood, and other casualty. Syempre na hitabo raman ang loss after the reporting period na. So, dapat ang buhaton ani sa entity, this just requires disclosure sa ato ang notes to financial statements but walay necessary adjustments. So, written representations and communication with those charged with governance. So, before we'll further discuss, let's first define unsa ning management representation letter. Kaning management representation letter is a letter written by the management to the auditor confirming all the representations made to him during the course of his audit. So, nagapamatuod ni sa mga inquiries ni auditor kay management. Karon, unsa bay purpose ani? The purpose of this letter is to emphasize that the financial statements are management's representation. So, kay management utana na representation. And thus, the management has the primary responsibility for their accuracy because number one, guys, ang na-adjure responsibility sa financial statements is ang management, dili ang auditor ha. Igo lang na nag-audit ang auditor. Also, such letter provides supplementary audit evidence of an internal nature by giving formal management replies to auditor questions regarding matters that did not come to auditor's attention in performing these audit procedures. So, usually, basta management representation letter, this prevents or minimizes any misunderstanding between the auditor and his client. So, mao to siya class, maong naatay written representation kay defense pud ni siya sa auditor if ever balihon sa auditor ay sa management ang auditor kay mao nang kailangan every after audit na-adjure kanang client representation letter na ang nakasulat usually dira kay si auditor nag-inquire siya with regards to the audit kay management o si management kay mo confirm sa representation niya na gihatag niya na information kay auditor. Okay, class. So, ayaw jud ninyo ni siya kalimti. So, towards the end of the audit, the auditor must consider the matters to be included in management's written representation. Requirement manggod ni siya sa ISA 580 in which kung equivalent sa diri sa Philippines kay PSA 580. Also, ang ato ang written representation letter kay that the date of the written representation shall be as near as possible to but not after the date of the auditor's report. Written representations are necessary audit evidence and therefore the auditor's opinion cannot be expressed and the auditor's report cannot be dated before the date of the written representations. Significant subsequent events may come to light very late in the audit and therefore written representations should cover all of the subsequent events period right up to the date at which the audit report is dated. Unsa man pud ning communication with those charged with governance? The matters to be communicated include significant findings from the audit and matters relating to the auditor's independence. In addition, the auditor must also consider whether the two-way communication between the auditor and those charged with governance has been adequate for an effective audit and have taken appropriate action if not. So, mubalik lang ko sa written representations class ha. So, si auditor should request management to issue written representations about its responsibilities. Gusto lang ko na may balaan ninyo kung unsa jud dapat ang sulod sa ato ang written representation. Una, for the preparation and presentation of the financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework, including the design, implementation, and maintenance of internal control relevant to the preparation and presentation of the financial statements that are free from material misstatement whether due to fraud or error. And ang ikaduha sa written representation na responsibility sa management is to provide auditor with first, all information such as records and documentation and other matters that are relevant to the preparation and presentation of the financial statements, any additional information that the auditor may request from the management, and unrestricted access to those within the entity from whom the auditor determines it necessary to obtain audit evidence. Okay? Kung mabasa ninyo ang kung ma-remember ninyo itong preconditions of audit, mauna ni siya. Mauna tong tulo na ako ang gi-mention. So, karon humanata sa completion of the audit. And then, we'll go to the fifth step na issuing the report. So, the fifth step contains an audit opinion, the conclusion of the auditor based on the evidence accumulated as to the fairness of the financial statement in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. So, what is an audit report? This is a medium through which an independent auditor expresses his opinion or disclaims an opinion. It is a letter communicating what was audited, the responsibilities of the client's management and the auditor, what an audit entails, and the auditor's opinion. So it must be made in writing and may be issued in hard copy format or using an electronic medium. So, nakasinabot ba ta unsay audit report? So, karon, let's discuss the types of opinion. So, the following report variations may be used. Una, A. A clean opinion if the financial statements are a fair representation of the entity's financial position, being free of material misstatements. So, this is also known as unqualified opinion. Ikaduha, we have qualified opinion if there were any scope limitations that were imposed upon the auditor's work. Qualified opinion. Sige, example lang ko ha. Qualified opinion if kintahay si independent auditor kay naa siya'y adjustment as to the impairment sa receivables kintahay ingno nato 1 million. Nag-adjust or naay gi-propose na adjustment si auditor, it is because 1 million is material enough to affect the financial statements as a whole. Okay? Tapos, karon ang gibuhat ni client is wala siya nag-adjust. So, ang buhato ni auditor is mag-qualify siya og opinion since ang adjustment na 1 million is material enough na maka-affect sa financial statements as a whole. And, maong qualified kay scope limitation man siya sa parts auditor. And then, letter C, an adverse opinion if the financial statements were materially misstated. So, kani siya kay kung ang term ani nila kay gubot pa sa lukot. So, wala jud, dili jud masabtan ang financial statements. Tapos, ang last, a disclaimer of opinion, which can be triggered by several situations. For example, the auditor may not be independent or there is a going concern issue with the auditee. So, maunay mga example sa disclaimer na opinion. Dili independent in that sense na kabalo naman mo na kanang related jud ang independent okay, di ka siya independent. Related jud ang auditor sa iyahang client. Okay, so again, atay upat ka opinion. Una, clean opinion or unqualified opinion. Ikaduha, qualified opinion na ay scope limitations that were imposed upon the auditor's work. Ikatulo, na atay adverse opinion. Ikaupat, na atay disclaimer opinion. So, unsa ba usual ta sulod sa ato ang audit report? The typical audit report contains 6 paragraphs which cover the following topics. Una is ang auditor's opinion. Ikaduha, basis for opinion. Third, key audit matters. Number 4, responsibilities of management and those charged with governance. Ikalima, auditor's responsibilities for the audit of the financial statements. Then, ang ikaunom, report on other legal and regulatory requirements. Ang kaning ikaunom, usually, ang ginabutang dari kay ka ng compliance with the BIR na ay certain na line dira na nagi-comply sa entity or sa company ang regulation sa BIR. So now, let's go to the post-audit responsibilities. Ano sa bang post-audit responsibilities? This includes the consideration of the following: subsequent events occurring between the date and the issuance of the auditor's report, which refers to katong type 1 ug type 2 na subsequent events. Nagiingon ako ganina, which can be adjusting events or dapat lang siya i-disclose na events. Tapos, ikaduha, the discovery of existing facts. So, nakoy question. What is the auditor's responsibility with respect to the facts which become known to the auditor after the date of the auditor's report but before the date of the financial statements are issued? I'll repeat, after the date of the auditor's report but before the financial statements are issued. So, the auditor has no obligation to perform any audit procedures regarding the financial statements after the date of the auditor's report. However, when after the date of the auditor's report but before the date of the financial statements are issued, a fact becomes known to the auditor that, had it been known to the auditor at the date of the auditor's report, may have caused the auditor to amend the auditor's report. Sige, so ako ang bisayaon. However daw, after sa date sa auditor's report, pero before sa date sa ato ang FS, nga pag-issue, a certain fact kay nahibal-an ni auditor na if nahibal-an to siya ni auditor at the date of the auditor's report, may have caused, pwede na if naibalaan to ni auditor at the date of the auditor's report, mag-amend siya sa auditor's report or iyahang i-change. The auditor should, una, i-discuss niya ang matter with the management and where appropriate with those charged with governance pod. Ikaduha, determine whether the financial statements need amendment because of that fact. Okay? Ikatulo, inquire how management intends to address the matter in the financial statements. So, mauto siya. Tapos, napakoy question. Unta, nasabtan to ninyo, class. Ikaduha, napakoy question. Sige. What is the auditor's responsibility with respect to the facts which become known to the auditor after the financial statements have been issued? Okay? After sa FS na. The auditor has no obligation to perform any audit procedures on the financial statements after such statements have been issued. However, when after the financial statements have been issued, after daw nag-i-issue ang FS, a fact, nanapuning a fact, becomes known to the auditor that had it been known to the auditor at the date of the auditor's report, may have caused the auditor to amend the auditor's report, the auditor should, maog yapon tong tulo, discuss the matter with the management and those charged with governance, determine whether the financial statements need amendment, o inquire how management intends to address the financial statements. Okay? Again, the auditor has no obligation to perform any audit procedures maskin pa og naay na hibalan si auditor na facts after sa issuance sa ato ang FS. Okay? Dapat i-consider ang tulo. And i-consider ang tulo if such fact had been known to the auditor at the date of the auditor's report and may have caused the auditor to amend the auditor's report. Unta class, nasabtan ninyo. If wala mo kasabot, pag question lang mo balik kay i-entertain lang jud nato ang questions by Wednesday. By Wednesday. Okay? Para mas ma-clear lang po kay if ever na jud may wala na sabtan, class ingatan ko ninyo kay aron matudloan pud tano. Ano lang. Tapos, the discovery of omitted procedures. Kani pud siya after the date of the audit report The auditor may conclude that one or more auditing procedures considered necessary in the circumstances were omitted from the audit. So, audit standard does not require the auditor to conduct any post-audit review from a post-engagement review performed during a firm's quality control inspection program or during an outside peer review. Ana lang. So, I think that sums up my report. So, if ever na mo'y questions, class, just click the Google Forms na link below and then i-entertain ako siya pagka Wednesday. So, tanang questions kay ako ang answeran. So, if ever na amoy questions, daghan, ibutang lang jud sa Google link kay aron ma-entertain ako tanan. And, just prepare kay basi magpa-oral ko. Basi lang, ana lang. Pero pag study lang mo class ha, basa-basahan lang ko ninyo tapos ibalik-balik ninyo ang video if ever necessary. Then pangutana lang jud, pangutana lang if ever wala mo nasabtan. Okay class? So I think mao lang to siya. Hopefully naagi hapon mo nasabtan sa ako ang mga gipangyaw-yaw. Then I think that's it. So thank you class and good day.